It's good to be back, and thank you for your presence. Man, it is encouraging. You encourage me so much. Thank you for being here. It's a blessing and a cursing, at least for me, from my perspective. This particular version of the Bible that I have and that I'm reading from has the words of Christ in red, and maybe you've got a Bible like that. The one that I had before this uh, did not, and it's a. I grew up, and most of the Bibles that I had the words that Jesus spoke in red. So it's a catch 22, really, because those are the words that it seems like you concentrate on more, and your eye is naturally drawn to them. I had one person tell me one time in our conversation, religious conversation that we were having, and he's not a member of the church, and he said, what really matters are those words in red. And I was like, yeah, I know what you're saying, but I wholeheartedly disagree. It's all of it, isn't it? And it's interesting as you look at those words in red and your eye is naturally drawn to them. Sometimes what happens is that we forget about the context, and the immediate context is what we're focusing on tonight. Because throughout the Gospels, as you read, especially the words of Christ, you're going to notice particular words that precede what Jesus says. And those words describe the way in which Jesus said them. There are a number of occasions when you read the words of Jesus, and what precedes them is the phrase where Jesus cried out. Jesus cried out. And what follows is this saying that Jesus did. Now, more times than any of the other gospel accounts, John records for us the times in which Jesus cried out. Now, what we would say growing up, and I'm changing a little bit, but we would say something like, Jesus hollered, all right? Jesus hollered. At the top of his lungs, this is what Jesus is crying out to the crowd. He is screaming. Let's look at those. In particular, from the Gospel of John, the first one, and we're going to move through the Gospel of John, starting at the beginning and ending in chapter 12. But Jesus cried out this idea that he can satisfy, coming from John chapter 7. Let's read this together. John chapter 7, beginning in verse 37. Jesus can satisfy. On the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up, and here it is, and cried out, if anyone thirsts, let him come and drink. Isn't that interesting? That's kind of an odd statement to stand up and holler at the top of your lungs. If anyone thirsts, let him come and drink. Well, Jesus within himself has the ability to satisfy, doesn't he? Maybe that brings to your mind, as it does mine, Jesus' conversation with that Samaritan woman there in John chapter 4. And he says, if you knew, in verse 14, he says, if you knew who was asking you for water, you would ask me for water, and I would give you living water, the water that wells up in a person, the water that brings you to eternal life. Well, she thought about it. Well, give me some of that water. That sounds pretty good. But Jesus has that ability to satisfy. Let your mind think about that. Jesus can satisfy you in a way that nothing else in the world can. People try to fill that, and we call it a God shaped hole, right? That's what we call it. People try to fill that God-shaped hole in their life with all sorts of different things, maybe even different people. And some of those are good things and good people, but it's not going to satisfy. If anyone thirsts, let him come. You remember Jesus in that Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, one of those Beatitudes as he begins, verse 6. You remember which one it is? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Have you ever been hungry? Have you ever been real hungry? I I was real hungry this past weekend. I went, everybody's perking up. Why were you hungry? Well, I was busy and I got to where I was skipping a few meals and I turned around and I was like, I don't think I've sat down to eat a meal in about 36 hours. And I'm hungry. Well, a pizza hit the spot, but can you often we don't hunger and thirst for righteousness, a pursuit of righteousness. When we find ourselves hungry or when we find ourselves thirsty, that's constantly on our mind, isn't it? We're always thinking, well, man, my belly's growling and I'm hungry and I'm trying to, what can I eat? What's going to hold me over? Righteousness. This is a beautiful thought. Isaiah writes for us in Isaiah chapter 55. And really, there's no good place to stop. It's just one of those passages. We're going to come back to verse 1, but let's put it in its context, okay? You know, we're familiar with Isaiah 55, whether you know it or not. But it's here that we read that in verse 8 and in verse 9, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts, right? We're familiar with that. But look at what comes before that. Verse 1, come, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. And he who has no money, come, buy him bread, buy and eat. Buy wine and milk without money and without price. Why do you spend, this is verse 2, why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen diligently to me and eat what is good, and delight yourselves in rich food. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear that your soul may live. And I will make you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David. Behold, I made him a witness to the peoples, a leader and commander for the peoples. Behold, verse 5 says, you shall call a nation that you do not know, and a nation that did not know you shall run to you because of the Lord your God and of the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you. Then in verse 7, seek the Lord. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, that he may have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. What a beautiful thought. Then it leads us into his thoughts are not our thoughts, they're higher. And come. Several times throughout this passage, the invitation is come. If you're thirsty, right, God can satisfy. God has that ability within himself to offer you satisfaction. I think it's interesting as I look in particular at verse 1, well, the invitation, anyone who thirsts. But look, if you're thirsty, this is what this is what God offers. I mean, if you're thirsty, we're expecting water, right? Buy wine. You got no money. Come buy wine and milk. Jesus gives above and beyond. When we come to God and we are seeking satisfaction, and when we are truly hungering and thirsting for righteousness, He will supply that need. And then He's going to give you more, a richer satisfaction than you can ever imagine. So Jesus stands up here during the feast and He cries out, He hollers, "Come, anyone who thirsts." Jesus offers satisfaction. Next, we turn our attention to one time, one moment that we're in John that we're probably familiar with. And Jesus has the power to resurrect. In John chapter 11, you remember the scene? We find ourselves Bethany, the tomb of Lazarus, at this occasion. He's been dead, and by now, surely the King James Version, he stinketh, right? But he comes to the tomb and he cries out once more. Let's read it together in verse 43. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, all right? So he is hollering again, "Lazarus, come out." The man in verse 44 who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." I love this because this it doesn't even make sense, does it? Here's a guy who's been dead, and Jesus, obviously, right? If somebody's sleeping, you're going to holler a little bit louder, "Wake up," than you would if they were awake. But how do you talk to someone who's dead? Jesus' voice is so powerful, it raises the dead. Now, I don't think it has anything to do with his tone or the way that he sounded, but Jesus' voice has the ability to reach beyond the grave, doesn't it? "Lazarus, come out." And he did. Unbind him, let him go. Jesus has the power as he cries out to resurrect. But his power lies, and it's described here in verse 25, where Jesus says to his sister Martha this. Verse 25. Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live." I want to bring our attention and put it under a microscope very quickly. I am the resurrection and the life. Two things. I am the resurrection and the life. Now, what we might be thinking Jesus is saying is that I have the power to resurrect. Or we might think that Jesus is saying, I can resurrect. I have that ability. But that is not what Jesus says, is it? I am the resurrection. The resurrection and I are synonymous. When you think about the resurrection, you are thinking about me. Now, that might bring a multitude of verses to your mind. He is the firstborn of all creation, right? He is the firstborn of the dead. This is Jesus that we're talking about. The resurrection. It suggests in our feeble minds that Jesus himself is the power of the resurrection. Now, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Paul, as he is in the Areopagus in Acts chapter 17, he talks about God. And he's describing God as this unknown God, you remember, and he said, I want to talk to you about him. And it's in him, he describes, it's in him that we live and move and have our being, isn't it? In God, we have our being. In Jesus, we have our resurrection. Isn't that interesting? I am the resurrection. I am the embodiment of what it means to be resurrected. I would suggest this. One implication of this idea is that you can't be resurrected outside of Jesus, isn't it? That if you're looking for some type of resurrection, it's not going to happen unless you are in Jesus, because Jesus is the resurrection. He also says that I am the life. Don't you love it? My mind goes to two places. One is in Genesis chapter 1, and the other is in John chapter 1. When God breathed into Adam the breath of life, I often wonder, what was that? In John chapter 1, of course, we read about Jesus, the life. It's interesting. Just before this, in John chapter 8 and verse 58, Jesus makes a subtle reference that I believe provoked those Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes to a degree of anger that they didn't know they had within them. Jesus, there in verse 58 of John chapter 8, he says, before Abraham was, I am. Before Abraham was, I am. The weight of that, well, they knew he was equating himself with God. But when we take it here in John chapter 11, I am the resurrection and the life. Well, there is no life outside of Jesus. There is no resurrection outside of Jesus. Jesus has the power as he cries out to resurrect, because he is the resurrection. One more here in John chapter 12 is that Jesus is the power to connect. As he cries out, we look at the next chapter in John chapter 12. The last time that it's recorded for us in John that Jesus cries out. It's found here in verse 44. Now, you remember the particular setting in which we're talking. We're talking about the Passion Week. And in fact, we are talking the day of the upper room. John chapter 12, verse 44, this is, as John records it, the very last thing that Jesus does or says before we enter the upper room. Now look at this in John chapter 12 and verse 44. And Jesus cried out and said, whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. Believes not in me, but in him who sent me. It's a very interesting statement to cry out. But Jesus, nonetheless, thought it was very important enough where he cried it out right there before we enter the upper room. Jesus has the power to connect us to God. That's what we find here in verse 44. That Jesus gives us that capability to connect to God. We connect to God here in verse 44. We connect to God via our faith, right? Whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. And whoever sees me sees him who sent me. Jesus connects us to God when Hebrews chapter 11, right? Verse 6, without faith, it is impossible to please God because you must believe that God exists. Whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him, the one who sent me. The faith that we have in Jesus, the belief that we have in Jesus connects us to a faith in God, the faith that brings us to obedience, which is what he talks about there in verse 47, verse 48. It's our obedience, right? This is another way in which we are connected to God via Jesus. Look at verse 47, verse 40. If anyone hears my words and does not keep them, I do not judge him, but I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. The one who rejects me does not receive my words, has a judge. The word that I have spoken will judge him on the last day. So our connection to God hinges upon, first of all, our faith, but it also hinges on verse 47, verse 48 suggested it hinges on our obedience to what he says. Are you going to obey? Let me put it this way. You can't be connected to God unless you're going to obey what Jesus has said. There is no relationship to God unless you obey him. Now, there's going to be a lot of people in the religious world that are going to tell you that all you need is faith and that your faith will save you. Yes, I believe your faith saves you. We're on the same page. I've read Hebrews chapter 11. I know all about it. But I've also read the rest of the Bible, and what it says here is our faith moves us to obedience, and our faith, coupled with our obedience, connects us with God. Now we keep reading. What does that lead you to? We're connected to God with our faith, with our obedience, and with verse 50, the very last thing he says here, our life. And I know that his commandment is eternal life. When I say, therefore, I say as the Father has told me. The commandment is eternal life. When we believe, when we obey, we have eternal life. Y'all, it's not complicated, is it? When we put them all together, it seems pretty simple. You believe, you obey, you inherit eternal life when we follow the steps. But for our premise here, Jesus has the ability to bring us into a relationship with God. Nobody else can do that. It's not possible in any other capacity except through Jesus. Jesus thought it was so important. He cried out, whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. I propose this evening that we are here and he's crying out again. If anyone thirsts, let him come to me, I can satisfy. If anyone is spiritually dead, unbind and let go. If anyone is lacking faith, come to Jesus. He can connect you to God if you but obey.